Are you sure? Good evening. All right. I'm Paul Levengood. I'm president of the Marshall Foundation, and after for us in Lexington at least, a long winter, I'm glad that spring is here. So the first Legacy Lecture of 2026 is a great opportunity to see all of you out of hibernation and around. So I can never say it enough, of course, but thank you for being with us, both here in person and out there on the live stream in cyberspace. Let me especially welcome the Marshall Foundation Board Trustees. You might see scattered among you. They're in town for our board meeting tomorrow. So for the rest of you, these are my bosses. So would you just keep the rowdiness down to a level? Thank you very much. Well, a couple of housekeeping items before I bring up this evening's special speaker. I'm very pleased, as always, to thank the sponsors of the Legacy Series who are making this year's slate of programs possible. And they include Dominion Energy Charitable Foundation, Edward Jones, Cornerstone Bank, and Raymond James. Now, you've heard me mention these generous sponsors at previous lectures, but I'm pleased to add two new local friends to our list tonight. First is the Lexington Sunrise Rotary Club. Any members here today? Oh, there we go. All right. As a one-time Rotarian myself, it is wonderful to have this support, and so please tell the club that we're delighted that you could answer yes to the third and fourth questions of the four-way test by supporting this event. If you know, you know. I'm also delighted to add our first individual sponsor of these lectures in some time, Ted Jutt. Ted is here, over there. Ted's a regular here in the audience, and he so values what the Legacy Lectures bring to his life that he has made a very generous gift toward this year's series. So please join me in thanking these sponsors. Because of their support, we are able to bring this program to the Lexington community and provide it free of charge. Their generosity also allows us to live stream these programs to anyone, anywhere in the world. And let me tell you, the audience for these is growing. From my parents in exotic Spain, mom and dad, hello, hola, to my wife's aunt and uncle in very exotic Florida. Diane and Jerry, I hope you're with us. But we do bring these audiences now in from around the world, which shows the interest in George Marshall and his times that we profile in these lectures. Our next lecture will be on April 16th, when John Kinder will present World War Zoos, exploring how our deadliest human conflict, World War II, was felt in the animal world, in the zoos of Warsaw, London, Berlin, Rome, and Tokyo. It's a fascinating topic, I promise you. Now, of course, for those of you who live here in Lexington, I invite you to join us after the lecture upstairs in the Camden Fine lobby for a reception and a book signing. For those of you on the live stream, well, I guess you're free to eat and drink on your own, but please do join us after the lecture upstairs. Finally, in housekeeping, please take the opportunity to check your cell phone and make sure that it's either switched to silent or off, even if your ringtone is Wild Blue Yonder. You don't want to be the person frantically trying to quiet your phone when it interrupts our speaker. Well, now for this evening's program. Dr. Sarah Myers received her undergraduate degree from the University of Missouri-Rolla and her master's from Missouri State. Leaving the Show Me State for the Lone Star, she then earned her PhD from Texas Tech University. She currently serves as Associate Professor of History and Peace and Conflict Studies at Messiah University near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. From 2020 through 2022, she was a recipient of a National Endowment of the Humanities Dialogue on the Experience of War grant for a program focused on generating dialogue with female veterans. For this grant, she led discussion workshops with veterans at the Military Women's Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. In a related vein, in 2023, she published Earning Their Wings, The WASPs of World War II and Their Fight for Veteran Recognition, with University of North Carolina Press. It is on the subject of that book that she will speak to us this evening. So please join me in a warm Marshall Foundation welcome to Sarah Myers.
Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you taking the time during a weeknight to learn more about these women pilots and invest in World War II history. It was great talking to some of you before this lecture about your personal interest in the WASP. I am here to talk about my research from the book. Since I obviously cannot talk to you about my entire book, what I have chosen to focus on tonight is the training experiences and also some of the assignments that the WASP had during World War II. And so my book covers the days of women in early aviation starting in the 1910s, and then it carries through unto the WASP military status when they get the access to veterans' rights in the 1970s. And so I'll reference that a little bit here in the talk, but I want to focus a lot on their training and military culture, because World War II is the first time that women are going to be officially in the military. There will be women from World War I who are in the Army Signal Corps that will get that status later. But for women who are serving during World War II in the Marines, Coast Guard, Army, and Navy, these women are eventually going to be given military status. And so that's going to change the relationship between women and the military in terms of their service and what's available to them. And so what I want to look at is particular for women in the Army Air Force, as I'm going to reference it. I know that it transitions from the Air Corps to the Army Air Force. So for the purposes of this talk, I'll kind of stick with Army Air Force or Air Force. So the two women before you are Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love. I personally think that these women should be household names like Amelia Earhart. That's my secret hope and dream, is that one day people will recognize their names as well, because both of these women were very accomplished pilots in the decades leading up to World War II. Both of these women were strategic thinkers about women in the military and women pilots in particular. And so basically what happens is after the war starts in Europe in September 1st, 1939, both Cochrane and Nancy Love separately decide that they want to talk to the military about the possibility of serving. We have friends who are use them for. And so Cochrane goes to the Army Air Force first. She talks to them in October of that year and says, hey, I, have these military connections. I think that you should make use of women pilots should the U.S. enter World War II. Because of women's status, just ideas about women serving in the military, the idea of women serving as pilots seemed controversial at the time, because there was this implied nature that women would be serving in combat. And since women historically aren't officially serving in combat, they are, not sure about the use of women pilots. So then separately and not in conversation with each other, Nancy Love goes to the Army Air Force in early 1940 and says the same thing, makes a similar pitch, and says, I really think that you should consider using women pilots. I think they would be useful for various reasons here on the home front. And again, are told like, no, but, thank you for your time. So fast forward then to 1942. So the U.S. is officially at war. Both of, Cochrane and Love have still been percolating on this thought about the use of women pilots. And so what they do is they go back to their connections in the Army Air Force again and say, hey, we really think you should take advantage of women pilots, especially now that we're officially at war and you have, casualties already in Europe. And we think that this would be a great use of women on the home front. But at the time, one of the things that was in the back of, at the time, the commanding Air Force General, Henry Hap Arnold, was that, I'm not sure that women are capable of flying military aircraft. So if you kind of set aside the thoughts about combat, I'm also just not sure that they can handle the technological skill, the physical strength of flying a military plane, all the different technologies that are going to develop during the war. And so he expresses, concern that maybe this isn't possible. So again, the idea sort of gets, tabled. But eventually what happens, and what we're going to look at here today, is that in September of 1942, the Army Air Force decides to give Nancy Love a program that will be called the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron. These are going to be a small unit of women, so 28 in total, who have experience like beyond the average, like, pilot in the US. These are women that have hundreds, if not thousands, of flying hours. And so for the women who are in the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, they're actually only going to get 30 to 40 hours of training before they are sent to then start ferrying planes across the US. And so these women are going to ferry planes from factories to bases and between bases in the US. Jackie Cochran, who, if any of you know a little bit about her and her personality, does not want to be outdone here. And actually, she's really offended that she wasn't told that Nancy Love's program was starting. And she's offended that she also didn't get to start a program, since she had also approached the Army Air Force in the years leading up to the US joining the war. And at the time, she, when she hears about this, she immediately contacts General Arnold and says, like, hey, what about me, basically. And so what happens is she is given a program that is different in nature from Nancy Love's program, and it is the Women's Flying Training Detachment. And so actually, as a part of this story, Jackie Cochran was leaving Britain, where she had brought over a group of women pilots to fly for the British Air Transport Auxiliary. And so she leaves there to come and start this program. This is a program for women at first who have 200 flying hours or more, and women are going to be given extensive military training. So they are going to get the exact same training as men in the Army Air Force, with the exception of combat. So combat flight maneuvers, that kind of thing. The program at first is going to train in Houston, Texas, and then it will be moved to Sweetwater, Texas. And the decision is made that they're going to have the women who are serving, in the Army Air Force, that they're going to have the same training as men as an experiment to see, okay, yeah, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, those women are highly qualified and have hundreds or thousands of flying hours. What about women who have less flying hours, who have the equivalent of men who are experiencing military training? What will happen with them? And so General Arnold literally says that he's not sure if women are going to be able physically or intellectually, and later throws in emotionally, to handle flying planes. So I will bring up the emotional element later, because the theory around this was that women would crash government planes, that, instead of being professionals. But we'll come back to that. All right, so these two programs, the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron and the Women's Flying Training Detachment, they are going to merge to form what we now know as the WASP. In July of 1943, Jackie Cochran is named as director, and then Nancy Love is under her with the ferrying division, which is the same work that she's been doing since the WASPs was founded. And the flying hours are going to reduce over the course of the war, from 200 to 150 to 100, and then later to 35. Those numbers are actually reflective of what the Army Air Force does for male pilots, and so that's referencing a similar trend where they just don't have enough pilots in the US with enough flying time, and so they're going to have to lower that requirement. The women also, at first, if you see for the Flying Training Detachment, when they go for military training, they have to be a minimum of 21 years of age. That will be reduced to 18.5 years of age. All right, so if you think about these two military programs of the WFTD and the WASP, there are 25,000 women roughly who the Army Air Force estimates applied to be a part of this military training. Of those, 1,830 were accepted for military training, and then 1,074 of them graduated. I'm going to explain the 11 trainees here in a little bit, but I did want to include them in this number. The 1,074 that graduated out of 1,830, if you do the math on that, that is actually the same graduation rate for male pilots. And in fact, in some months, it was a little better than male pilots, and other months, it was like the equivalent. Because you don't want just anyone flying military planes, right? It's very skilled work. This is very expensive taxpayer dollars that are going into all of these new technologies. And so they want the best of the best. If anyone's seen, Top Gun, or insert a famous, aviation movie here. All right, so they're organized as military. So the idea is that, like the women who are in the Women's Army Corps, the Women Marines, the WAVES who are in the Navy, the SPARs, the women who are in the Coast Guard, the hope is that they will eventually get military status. And what had to happen for that was Congress voted whether or not to grant military status. So Arnold decides, he informs Cochrane that you need to make sure that these women are, everything about them is military, so that way it's a seamless transition when Congress votes on the bill. So on the right, you see a picture from one of the graduation ceremonies, and I always like this picture in particular because it references the West Texas flat, arid climate, which is also where I went to grad school because I wanted to be near Sweetwater, Texas, because I wanted to experience the climate, but I also wanted to get to interview the WASP at their reunions in Sweetwater, Texas. And so I always feel like this picture encapsulates the experience living in West Texas. The image on the left is one of the WASP who I interviewed, and the reason why I included this photo is because when the WASP are organized as military, they're issued military uniforms. They are issued dog tags. They take an oath to the Constitution. They are following military rules and regulation. And actually, in some instances, they follow additional rules and regulations on top of what male trainees and then male graduates experience. They're also experiencing a lot of, not just the atmosphere of West Texas, but also what does it mean to be military? If they very much feel like this transition from civilian to military that happens during their Army Air Force training is something that's special and unique for them career-wise. And so they identify as both pilots and, want that for a career, but they also identify as military and feel very proud of their military service. And so one of the WASP, Marty Weil, who I interviewed, this is a picture of her in her home. Back in the day, Marty's no longer with us, but back in the day, I did get her permission to use her photograph. And I wanted to use it because when I was interviewing her about her service, she, at one point in the interview, excitedly got up and was like, "Do you want to see my military uniform?" And I said, "Absolutely, I do." And so she ran to get it for me, and she's like, "It doesn't fit, but I'm going to hold it up for you." And I was like, "That's great," and also, very relatable. And so she was so proud of her military service that I think is something that, often gets lost when we think about women flying for the military. And so I appreciated this photo and her enthusiasm and pride in her uniform specifically and what that represented to her. In a 1943 letter home to her sister, WASP Adeline Alma Blank wrote, "It gives me a peculiar feeling to be wearing an official identification tag around my neck. Somehow it intensifies the significance of the whole thing. Now I think I really am a part of this war." And there is evidence in their letters home, in their oral history interviews, and in media interviews of this, where they talk about this transition and how they really felt that they were a part of the war effort. In particular, some of the WASP join because they want to avenge men's deaths from their family. There are WASP who join because they lost a husband, brother, father, uncle. There are also women who join who reference the men and nurses who are POWs in the Philippines and say that they want to avenge, what happened to those individuals, that, their status is unknown. And so the WASPs talk about this, and they also talk about the fact that they love aviation and love flying, and they really want the opportunity to get to do this in the future, and continue. And so I think that quotes like this represent kind of the atmosphere of the World War II era and the ways that a lot of people, their military service signified what they were doing for their country in particular, but also happened to intersect with something that they truly love to do. So during training, they experienced all levels. So this is an example from ground school. So they experienced ground school classes where they learned physics, navigation, math, all sorts of subjects that would be useful to them in flying or in cross-country navigation, things like that. They also had the experience of learning how to fly navigation in a technology that was developed in the 1930s. These were called link trainers. And basically, if you can kind of see here, I'm going to show you another photo in a second. It's this small sort of mini plane that you sit in. And then if you look above her head, there's a lid there. And what they do is they shut you in this tiny contraption and you fly via instruments so that you can practice, bad weather flying and things like that. And so some of the WASP in particular talk about flying in the link trainer as exhilarating and exciting because they feel really proud of themselves. And others talk about being claustrophobic and feeling a lot of anxiety in this box and sweating a lot because, it's not air conditioned in there and it's hot in Texas and things like that. This is a kind of gives you a pullback image of what these link trainers look like and the fact that they're teaching you to fly on instruments and that you have an instructor who is going to control what happens to you, from afar outside this box, as some of the women call it. And then you're given, if you kind of see at the top, different things that you're going to have to navigate as you're flying, right? Thinking about your altitude, airspeed, etc. They also fly across country. They learn how to fly primary, basic, and advanced, all on the base at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, which is different than the training for male pilots. Their training was spaced out for primary, basic, and advanced. You went to different airfields for that most of the time. But the WASP in particular are going to be experiencing all three levels at the same base, because there were concerns about rumors of women serving in the military. The thing that I always remind my students of is that, when women are serving in these new roles in the military, and particularly for the WASP, who are literally doing nothing that's considered traditional for women, right? They're flying military planes, which while women have been flying since the 1910s, it's still new for them to serve in the military in such a non-traditional way. And so in this era, there were rumors about women serving in the military. And the thing I remind my students of, for example, is just the simple act of wearing pants in public wasn't something that women did. This is something culturally that you wore a dress or skirt in public. There were all these conversations that Amelia Earhart used to have with the media about her use of pants. And she said, it's safer this way. You can't fly in a skirt or dress. That's just not practical. And so when they're experiencing training, or you're thinking about this, Cochrane is very much concerned that there will be negative stereotypes about the WASP. So the Women's Army Corps at this point, by 1943, had experienced rumors about what they were doing in the military. So some said that women were serving as prostitutes for the Army, which is absolutely not true, but this is what the media is spreading about them, because they're like, what else can women possibly be doing overseas, right? They also spread rumors about the women's sexuality and say that like this is going to upset gender roles, but also women's sexuality is going to change and they're going to go from heterosexual to homosexual because they're serving in the military. And so the WACs really go through this with the media. There's a lot of slander campaigns against them. And so since the Army Air Force is under the umbrella of the Army, Jackie Cochran's like very much aware of this and doesn't want any of these rumors to spread about the WASP. And so she actually requires extra rules and regulations for the WASP outside of what's typically required for men in the Army Air Force because of this. So dating is not allowed. You're not supposed to date your, during training, you're not supposed to date your instructor. You're not supposed to go on dates in public because again, she doesn't want rumors about women's sexuality. Women weren't allowed to wear their PT shorts in public. They could only wear them on base during PT. You couldn't wear them anywhere else. They also had rules about when they wore their dress uniform. She said that she preferred for it to be the skirt version of their dress uniform when at all possible, and there was a set of rules associated with that. And the women were also, as they, left training and graduated and served on military bases, also had very similar rules about dating and, what times there were curfews set for some of them that they followed and things like that. A typical day of training, again, this is just kind of to give you an idea of how long these days were. They would have their TAPs wake up, they would have breakfast in the mess hall, and then they'd immediately go to instrument flying, and from there to PT, and from there to ground school, and then eventually the flight line for check rides, which would take multiple hours because you often had to wait for your turn, get feedback, etc. Sometimes you were doing a cross-country flight. And then there would be a meeting after dinner with updates or information that Cochrane wanted to relay. And then they would have, TAPs and in bed by 10 p.m. So when you think about like a typical day, they were very much focused on just this during the 5.5 to 7 months of training that they experienced. So keeping this in mind, and especially with what I was saying about dating and Cochrane wanting to keep all forms of training on the same base, the women often used a sense of humor to talk about their experiences during training in West Texas. And so if you look at these two signs, it's the same sign, but look at these two images, right? So there were signs throughout the base that talked about women trainees only in this area. And what happened when the base at Sweetwater was established for the WASP, because prior to that, there had been British pilots flying from our allies. And so when it's established for the WASP, they decide like, okay, we're going to try to keep these rules and regulations about dating, etc. But when Army Air Force male pilots heard about the base at Sweetwater, all of a sudden there was an abnormal number of emergency landings at the fields. Yes. And so they were like, okay, well, we can't really, this isn't sustainable, right? Like, and we know what they're doing. And so we're just going to cut this off. And so Cochrane is like, under no circumstances is there going to be an emergency landing. You can land outside the base if you have a problem. And so the women call it Cochrane's convent because they were completely sealed off from men and not supposed to date and, all these other rules. And so I like the women on the right implying, that they want men to be on base with them, right? By covering up the W and the O. So they're using this sense of humor to try to, talk about their experiences and the things that they're thinking about, but it also reflects male pilots and also men who are serving in other units in the military, where they will use a sense of humor, sometimes even, dark humor to get through experiences or hard times. And so for women who are serving in the Army Air Force as pilots for the first time, what this means is that the technologies in these aircraft are not developed for their bodies. And that's significant even through today. I have women pilots all the time who are sharing information with me about what they experience. But what this means is that cockpit size, uniform sizes, etc., were made for men's bodies. And so what's crazy is that the WASP would, in some instances, have to literally take books or manuals and sit on them to be able to reach the control panel of some of the aircraft that they were flying, for example. And there are all these stories of ways that they adapted things for themselves. And so one of those examples is through uniforms. And so the WASP are calling... Yeah, they're calling their flight suits zoot suits, which reference the World War II era and the zoot suit riots, and the fact that, you know, the original zoot suit has to do with excessive fabric in men's suits. And so they say that their flight suits are zoot suits because they're not made for men and they have to tie them up and, you know, roll them up to get them to like fit or work for them as they're flying and experiencing these different things. There are also stories that I don't have time to go into, but if you're interested in my book, I do talk about the fact that even things like the oxygen mask and the tube where you relieve yourself in the airplane were not available for women, which there's still issues with that even today. And so I talk about some particular examples because essentially what the women had to do was dehydrate themselves on these really long flights across country because there wasn't an opportunity to do anything about it really in the airplane. They creatively came up with some solutions, but there wasn't that technology for them. So they're all going to talk about West Texas, which is what I was most interested in learning about when I moved to West Texas. So in the base at Sweetwater, they had what they called the Avenger, which was their newsletter. And the newsletter was anything that they wanted to publish and talk about with the war. They're later going to have a newsletter that kind of circulates different bases that they, you know, call the Fifinella Gazette. And so they use these newsletters as kind of like an outlet for humor, but also to talk about serious issues and give each other advice and things like that. And what I find fascinating, and some of you might know about, is that other units during World War II did the same thing. So there were men at various bases and tank divisions, etc., who also created their own newsletters during the war, and sometimes, you know, even doing this overseas as a way to kind of boost morale and camaraderie and think about, you know, their experiences and kind of process it. And so I use this one to represent Wendy on the flight line today with the woman whose hair is clearly like highly chaotic, right? Another one that I think, you know, kind of summarizes some of these things is there was a letter home that was published in one issue of the newsletter. And in this letter home, the trainee is talking about the fact that on the base at Sweetwater, there's a flagpole. And depending on what flag is hanging, it represents what you're supposed to wear for the day. Do you wear your civilian clothes? Do you wear your zoot suit? Like, what are you wearing? And so she says, yesterday, they, like meaning at the field, had the green and red flag up. So what this means is they had the flag up for civilian clothes and also for flight suits up at the same time accidentally. And so she said some of the girls put their dress-up clothes on over their zoot suits. You should have seen them. Hot but humorous. That's how we are here most of the time in Texas. And then she says, this is referencing, you know, the generation and the relatability between generations. She says, this is kind of, that's putting it mildly, a manless place. One of my baymates, Bobby, said, they can just keep my paycheck if they'll only let the wolf at my door. And she expresses well how most of us feel. So again, they're like feeling what men will also express about not seeing a woman, right, for extensive service, especially in combat in the Pacific, for example. In West Texas, there's also these comments, not just about your hair, but also about your skin and just everything getting dried out. So I loved this line. It's the third one down, where she says that she's now using saddle soap recommended by her mother as care for all fine leather in place of cream for her face. So again, trying to make the most of the circumstances, right? All right, if any of you know Deep in the Heart of Texas, this can be running in the back of your mind as I read the lyrics here. But they also came up with songs just like male units did. And so in these songs, they often are reflecting their humor or again, like advice, like they do in the newsletters. So this says, "We damn near freeze in these open PTs, deep in the heart of Texas. We've never, excuse me, yeah, we're never at our ease in these big BTs." So they reference primary trainers. Now they're referencing basic trainers, which is the next level up. "Deep in the heart of Texas. If you don't lock the latch, you'll fall out of the hatch. Deep in the heart of Texas. If you don't relax, you'll be in Airfax. Deep in the heart of Texas." And then at the very bottom, it says, "Tower, I think I'm lost. Do you know where I am?" They also had a song about zoo suits and parachutes in which they reference, post graduation, what is it like serving on bases around the country where often you're one of a handful of women or maybe the only woman serving on the base. And so some of the songs reflect, advice that they have for each other in these circumstances and cultures, and other times, referencing humor, or sometimes they'll even reference important things to think about before you get in the aircraft, like things to remember. And they'll do like little mnemonic devices for each other to remember important information. And so in particular, this song is referencing, I'm now serving officially in the Army Air Force in the ferrying division. I'm in Washington, D.C. And she goes on to tell this story about dating a male pilot. And she says that, I'm dating for the first time, etc. And at the very end, she says, "The moral of the story, as you can plainly see, is never trust a pilot an inch above the knee. He'll kiss you and caress you and promise to be true and have a girl at every field, just like pilots do." To reference their, attitudes and thoughts, but also to give, a little warning about men and what they thought about dating in this experience. All right, so another aspect of their culture that also is, resonates for male pilots is Walt Disney during the war gave a lot of men's units permission to use his various characters that he developed as the mascot for their unit. In some cases, Walt Disney even created, a mascot, a completely new cartoon character that men would then use in their in whatever circumstance they wanted to, basically. He gave them open, free permission to print these images, use them however they wanted to. And so the same is true for the WASP. So the WASP actually asked Walt Disney for permission to use the image that you see on the left that's on one of their patches. So this image, this cartoon character is called Fifi Nella. And Fifi Nella was a gremlin in British pilot Roald Dahl's book, The Gremlins. So this was in collaboration and copyrighted by Disney. Disney's developing the characters in the book, and Roald Dahl is writing the story. And so in the story, The Gremlins, there is this experience that's universal to all pilots, that they talk about the fact that, every now and then they have some sort of mechanical issue that is unexplainable, that, they're struggling to figure out, or that the mechanic on base is, unclear. They're like, "I don't see it. What do you see?" Maybe some of you've had this when you have cars, right? And your car is being fixed. And so pilots develop this idea of the gremlin. And so they often reference, "I hope the gremlins are on my side today," because the gremlins are the ones that do this mysterious, problems or mess with your aircraft. So one of the gremlins was named Fifi Nella, and she was a female gremlin. And so the WASP adopt her as a character as sort of like a superstitious mascot, to be like, Fifi Nella's on our side. Like, she's going to help us, right, with our problems, etc. And to this day, there are women pilots who will put a Fifi Nella patch or pin on their uniform to represent and kind of be a nod to the WASP, who were the first women to fly military aircraft. And it also references the fact that the WASP are thinking very much about their military service, but also as professionals. So when they give each other advice, they are also thinking about how can I continue this as like a career? And so when they use images or talk about jokes with the gremlins, they're very much aware that military aviation and even civilian aviation in the 1940s is still very dangerous. There are new technologies that are developed during the war, like the B-29, which experiences engine difficulties, where early iterations engines would catch on fire, and then they eventually worked that out. And so the WASP often, kind of hold this in the back of their minds, right? That there are really great pilots in the continental United States who have died because of accidents associated with the weather, something associated with their plane that's unexplainable, or sometimes pilot error, but oftentimes not. And so there are all these things that they have to kind of navigate or work through. And so the 11 trainees who I referenced on that early slide, who I view as honorary WASP, are 11 trainees who died during training. And so those women in particular aren't officially recognized as a WASP, but they were, because they died during training before graduation. But those women very much died in service to their country in the same way that male pilots also died on the home front as a result of, training and what that looks like. So after graduation, the WASP are going to be stationed at Army Air Force bases across the continental United States. They're going to fly primarily within this region of the US. There will be a few exceptions where there are a couple flights to Cuba and also to Canada, but other than that, they're in the continental United States. And when they're stationed at these bases, they're, like I said before, sometimes the only woman, sometimes there's just one, or sometimes there's multiple WASP who are serving. And so one of the examples at Eagle Pass Army Airfield, where the WASP towed targets, which I'll explain in just a second, you can see like the number of women who are serving at the base. So in particular for this experience, the WASP feel that camaraderie and sense of culture. But for the WASP who are isolated on these other bases, where maybe there's one or just a handful of them, they talk about how the WASP newsletter really helped them feel like they were still a part of the culture of the WASP, and they felt like training was the thing that bonded them together and just made them like fit as like a cohesive unit. So if you look at this image in particular, I also wanted to point out that the women who are serving in the WASP were considered to be white or who could pass as white. You had to do a face-to-face interview with Cochrane or one of the women that she hired for this work. And the reason was because Cochrane was worried about women of color serving in the WASP and what that could mean. In particular, she was really worried about Black women because she thought that Black women would make the program seem more controversial even than just women flying in non-traditional work. And so she rejected any Black women pilots who were applicants to the project. In particular, on the far right, you see Ola Mildred Rexroth, who was a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe. She is a Native American woman. There was another Native American woman and also 2 Chinese American women who served in the WASP. But it's been really difficult for me to track down if there were other women who identified as other ethnicities outside of white, because they had to pass as white. It was not really talked about in the sources. And so when you think about the women who are serving, I wanted to emphasize that in particular, like for this program. So towing targets was one of the more dangerous jobs that the WASP held during the war. When they're given these assignments, they're still considered to be civilian. So towing targets meant that if you look at the image from the top left, this is a target that's being towed. And if you look at the bottom right, there's an anti-aircraft artillery gun on the right. So what they would do is they would practice, men would practice on the ground anti-aircraft artillery with empty casings, and they would shoot them at the targets that the WASP would fly in a straight line back and forth at the same altitude. And so when the WASP are, declared a success by Arnold, and he's like, okay, this program's going great, women are flying, we're doing well, he decides that he wants to increase the different assignments that the women have. So ferrying has gone great. So one of the other assignments then is towing targets. So what he does is, in conjunction with Cochrane, is they slowly replace male pilots who are towing targets with the WASP. So there are male pilots who are also towing targets. And one of the things that I argue is that in this work of towing targets, which is incredibly dangerous and scary for the pilots who are experiencing it, as soon as women start towing targets, the male pilots change their narrative with their commanding officers about their experiences towing targets. So there are men who now start calling target towing chores, and say, they use the word chore a lot, and say that these are just like menial chores, like we don't want to be assigned to this anymore. Like just, let the WASP take over these jobs. And a part of what they say with the chore reference is they say like, this is just flying the same pattern repeatedly in the air at the same altitude, right? Like anyone can do this is the implication. And so Arnold has these conversations with Cochrane and also these commanding officers about this. And one of the things I argue is that the WASP are disrupting ideas of heroic military service and like what it means to be a hero, because a lot of these men directly tell their commanding officers that when they don't want to do these chores anymore, that they would rather die overseas than on the home front. And so prior to the WASP participating in this assignment in any way, they're referencing the fact that, they don't want to die on the home front. They don't view that as heroic. And then as soon as the WASP start doing it, they jump in with like, here, this is a chore, like women can do this, we don't want to do this. And so in doing that, they're undermining the professionalism of the WASP and their military service, and not acknowledging the fact that this was work that men had done like prior to this, and also was something that's like very important that you're like highly skilled at doing. I love including quotes about the WASP and their perspectives on flying, because they all have these ideas about what it was like to fly and how much they loved it. And so WASP by Cowden said that the P-51 was the love of my life. It was so well engineered that when you were flying and once you had it trimmed, if you leaned forward, it would go forward. If you leaned back, it would go up. You could turn it, you didn't have to touch it. And so I loved their descriptions of, what it was like to fly these military aircraft and how it was so much different than civilian aviation. Planes like the P-51, a pursuit aircraft, flew so much faster. Bomber planes were a heavier plane to fly than civilian aircraft at the time. They were, slow and heavy, and they loved flying them. And so with all of these different planes, including one WASP who got to participate in jet testing, they're very excited about flying heavier or faster or at higher altitudes like the bomber, right, aircraft than civilian aircraft would allow them to do. And so this was like the thing that they loved doing. When you think about this like love of flying and also the reality of what this type of work means during World War II and what this military service means, there are a total of 38 WASP who lose their lives in service to the nation during World War II. At the bottom right, this is a memorial service for 38 WASP casualties at Sweetwater, Texas. They hold an annual event every May around Memorial Day in commemoration of the WASP and their military service. And they always acknowledge and have a service for these 38 WASP. And the 38 includes the 11 trainees. Of the women who were casualties during the war, which you can also see represented in this newsletter at the top left, they would have a memorial section in their newsletter to acknowledge the WASP. You see Jane Champlin here on the left saying that we won't forget you, the way you made us laugh, the many friends you found among all our classes, or the cause for which you made your sacrifice. On the right, top right, this is the same issue of the newsletter, and they're also acknowledging the instructor who also died in this crash with Jane, and offering him a happy landings, which is a common phrase said between pilots. And so these women, because they were civilian, they didn't have military benefits. So that meant that even for the WASP, because there are examples I found where a WASP would get some weird like fungus when she was flying a cargo plane because men on the plane had come from the South Pacific, and somehow she got whatever it was that they were carrying with them. They had to file claims with their civilian insurance for all these weird, unique situations because they were still officially civilians. They also had issues because they were not military with the loss of these 38 lives. And so what happened was they were not supposed to have a military funeral, although I found examples where some of the WASP in their local communities, they decided to hold a memorial service specific to the military in their, local hometown. But they were not supposed to have a military service. They were not supposed to display a gold star in the window because they were not military, they were civilian. And this meant that for some of the women, their families had to pay to ship their bodies home, or Cochrane had to pay to ship their bodies home, or Cochrane, in a lot of these cases, would send the WASP with the body to accompany it and would take it to the family. And this is all because they weren't officially military. And so what happens in 1944 is the congressional bill, it finally gets to the WASP. All the other women's units during World War II had received military status from Congress at this point, and so now we're down to the WASP. Commanding General Army Air Force, Henry Hap Arnold gives testimony before Congress and says, hey, these women need to be given military status, just like you've given military status to other women in the Army who are in the Army Corps. Here's why. Government officials like Secretary of War Henry Stimson also gave testimony and was like, hey, this is why this program is so important. They've already been organized as military. Please go ahead and, make them military. When Congress is voting on the WASP bill, there are a lot of things that are happening all at once. And one of the things that comes out during 1944 in the summer is a Hollywood movie that was called Ladies Courageous. And so Ladies Courageous, which I finally one day tracked down in an archive and I finally got to watch because it's very hard to get a hold of. If you know of any copies, let me know. But as I was watching this film, the plot of the movie is that there are women who are in like ambiguous military uniforms. So it doesn't say Army Air Force. They don't have the patches, but it's kind of implied. In fact, the Army Air Force allowed the film crew, the set, to borrow planes from the Army Air Force to use in the film. And if, as you can see from the poster, there are women who are doing this flying, right? So they're flying actual Army Air Force planes, and while it doesn't say that they're in the WASP, that's the implication. And so in this movie, the women are flirting with men and crashing planes. They're stealing planes in the middle of the night to go fly for fun, to do tricks. All things that were not allowed under the WASP, all things that the WASP would never dare do because they're military professionals, And so in this film, it just, at one point, I remember reading, there was a New York Times review of the movie, and it said that it made military women pilots look like, quote, nitwits. So I think that kind of sums up what I'm going for here. So in this movie, Congress is going to debate, like, do we want to grant these women military status? We've heard from top Air Force brass. We've also heard from government officials. What do we want to do here? And one of the things that's baffling as you're reading through this discussion is that they bring up this movie and say, like, hey, I saw Ladies Courageous. Like, I don't think we want to give these women, these aren't serious pilots, right? Others reference media coverage of the WASP because the WASP were on the cover of Life magazine in July 1943. And so they reference like, oh, you saw that Life magazine article. All they're doing is sitting around, right? Like they're waiting on the flight line, which is what is portrayed in the article. But in the article, they don't really show women, actively flying planes with like a few tiny exceptions. And so they're like, oh, they're just, sitting around. In the Life article, they also had them sunbathing. So they're like, oh, they're just having a good time. And so when they reference like, what do we want to do here? One of the prevailing arguments is that like, oh, these aren't really serious pilots. I don't really think that we need to give them military status. There is also, I'm not going to go into all the details of it because I also have this in my book, but there was a civilian pilot training program at the time that was a New Deal era program. That program, because of Eleanor Roosevelt's campaigning, trained 1 woman for every 10 men in flying. This program started in 1939. There's the idea that the U.S. might be going to war and we might need pilots, built up in reserve. And so a lot of the WASP actually initially got their flying hours and training experience through this free civilian Air Force, or the CPTP program, the Civilian Pilot Training Program. And so they're learning how to fly through that. And that program shuts down in the summer. And so there's a whole thing happening with that. And so ultimately, Congress decides, no, we are not going to grant the WASP military status, and they reject the bill. So in December 1944, the Army Air Force officially shuts down the WASP program, much to Arnold and other officials' disappointment. This is a picture from a WASP farewell dinner where the WASP were drawing straws to see who got to take the last ferrying mission of flying some pursuit aircraft, the P-47. And so they're sitting around at dinner talking about this. There are going to be WASP who offer to fly after the war for $1, a year. So in 1945, they're like, we'll fly for just $1. If you have to pay us, we'll keep doing service. And then after the war ends, they make the same, proposal, but they're not accepted. And so after World War II, women don't fly military aircraft again until 1973 when the Navy admits women for pilot training, and then the Army shortly after this. I like this. Some of you got excited when I mentioned the Navy. And so when you're thinking about this kind of transition or journey for women, what this means is that from 1944 to 1973, women aren't flying military aircraft. That's significant because during the space race, you had to have jet experience to even be considered to be an astronaut, to be a part of the space program. And so the women who are pilots in these decades don't have that opportunity. They're immediately rejected by NASA because they don't have that jet experience, which they can't get because they can't serve in the military. The women who are the WASP, some of them try to get flying jobs. Some of them go to commercial aviation, different companies, and say, hey, I would love to be a commercial pilot. Can I have an application? I flew for the military, right? I have extensive experience. And they're told, the American public's just not ready for that yet. We're not ready for women to be pilots, to fly us across the country, which is, wild to think about, right? When you think about these commercial planes versus all the different military planes that the WASP were flying. And if you were a ferry pilot as a WASP, you flew multiple types of aircraft, so you have even more experience. And so they're told no, but hey, here's a flight attendant application, go ahead. And so very few women found opportunities in aviation outside of civilian or outside of jobs where they would literally just, fly cargo around for different random jobs that wasn't a permanent position, but was contracting work. And then the WASP also, after the war, stay in touch with each other and talk about the fact that they really wanted those 38 women to have recognition, and that's something that really bothers them because when you don't have military status, after you are done with your service, it means that you don't have access to the GI Bill during World War II in particular. So you don't have the access to medical care, you don't have education, reduced loan rates, all of that. But also it means that, like I said, for those 38 women, they don't have that designation. And so they talk about this and kind of meet for reunions sometimes. I always remind people this is pre-email, right? So they're writing letters and newsletters to each other still. And eventually in the 1960s, they're going to harness this, idea about the 38 women pilots and wanting to get them veteran status, but also harness what they've already done with their own identity and camaraderie that they built as a part of the WASP program to make a really concerted effort and organize themselves to present a bill before Congress. So eventually there's a bill that goes before both the House and the Senate and passes and is signed into law in 1977, granting these women veteran status. And so that's when they officially get that veteran status and recognition, which means that eventually, it took a while because there were paperwork and other obstacles, but eventually that means they can be interned at Arlington National Cemetery, for example. In 2010, they received the Congressional Gold Medal, which is a picture from that ceremony, and also the top right is a Congressional Gold Medal from the front that the WASP received. There are going to be like other aspects to their story that come, but one of the things that I argue about their struggles is that, for the duration of this second half of the 20th century, it's a perpetual fight to try to prove their military nature of the program and prove themselves as veterans, which is not dissimilar from how a lot of female veterans feel about the invisibility of their service for the U.S. military. But also it represents the fact that these women viewed themselves as professional and as pilots and as military specifically in an era that, predates anything they could have hoped or dreamed about happening in the 1970s. So with that, I am happy to take any of your questions about the WASP program or anything associated with it. The image on the right, by the way, is from a WASP reunion where they're singing some of their class songs, which I wish that I had some files get destroyed, and I wish I could play that for you. So instead, you have a picture. So does anybody have any questions about anything at all? Yes.
The first ferry pilots who had 500 hours, how did they get those hours?
Great question. Okay, so I'm going to repeat for the people who are online. So for the women who are in the WAFs, like how did they get the 500 or more hours of flying time? The women who are in that program are actually really interesting because most of them are wealthy. They came from families that could afford flying hours. And so not all of them, it doesn't apply to everybody, but the majority of them came from money. And so their parents could pay for them to get flying lessons. They could also pay to keep their license active, and in some cases advance to kind of like Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love. They could participate in air races, set records and competitions and things like that. And that's a part of why the wartime New Deal program that was so significant is that the civilian pilot training program helped lots of women get access to aviation that didn't have it before. So a lot of women in the WASP talk about how they didn't have money for pilot training, but that government program made it possible for them. Some of the women who were in the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron also did have really unique ways of generating income for themselves. So some of them would offer at their local airport to fix planes in exchange for lessons. There were some women I found who would perform stunts at air shows. So they would, not with the plane yet, because they weren't pilots yet, but they would jump out of the planes with a parachute and do stunts and things like this to try to get money to then use towards flight lessons. And something that kind of united all the women who are in this umbrella of the WASP is, trying to think creatively about how to get, flying and access to flying, but also just this idea that they just really wanted to be in the sky, and they viewed the sky as like a space of liberation and freedom for women that was unlike anything they felt like they experienced on Earth. Yes. Yeah, so the question was, what happened to Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love after the war? Nancy Love was, she had a different personality than Cochran. So Jackie Cochran was a very outgoing, like extrovert, but also very like scrappy. She came from poverty. She hid her background and identity, so we're not even fully sure what year she was born. And then eventually she makes her way up, like, the social ladders, and eventually marries a billionaire and has a makeup company, but also is a pilot. So she flies with her makeup company and is in air races and, has all these access to aviation. And she loves doing media interviews and she loves talking to people. Nancy Love is an introvert. So all the women who talk about kind of their different leadership styles and what these women were like say that Nancy Love hated doing interviews in the media. She did them because she was asked to, but she hated doing it. And she tried to keep like out of the spotlight. And so for Nancy Love in particular, she's not doing anything that's like public or in the media. She still has access to some aviation opportunities. There's a story that I include in the book that's really interesting to me in that she got to fly. She's the only woman that's known to have done this, probably the only one, who gets to fly in the China, Burma, India theater, but not officially. She just takes over the controls of the aircraft. But she doesn't really get any like opportunities to do anything in aviation really outside of just her personal connections in civilian. Jackie Cochran is interesting because she's friends with Chuck Yeager, for example. She's friends with General Arnold. She was friends with the Roosevelts, so Eleanor would regularly have her over for tea or dinner or whatever. And so Jackie Cochran's like connections allowed her to do things that other women like didn't have access to, like being the first woman officially in a jet aircraft, for example, and breaking the speed of sound. She tried to get women to become astronauts in the era of NASA in the 1960s and the space program, because she was, again, like with the WASP, she was campaigning like, hey, women pilots would be great to be astronauts. You should test their bodies and see what happens to them in space, etc. And so she and, she gets some help financially, but she also uses money from her business to fund this program to test women, but then NASA eventually like doesn't accept it. But her ulterior motive, even though she was like literally too old, was that she wanted to be an astronaut. And so she was like she was doing tests herself like as well. And so she was always trying to do things and had the opportunity, but she just honestly was fortunate in that like respect. In the very back. Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so the question was, can you talk about the relationship between Jackie Cochran and Colonel Hobby of the Women's Army Corps? So this is fascinating to me, and I also include this in the book because there was a discussion when these congressional bills were going before Congress. Should we have the Women's Army Corps? Should we take that and put the WASP like under it, kind of like an umbrella, like the formation of the other two pilot programs? Should we have it, the Women's Army Corps be the umbrella and the WASP be like a unit? Like, what should we do? And Cochrane used a lot of profanities in her response about this. And basically, if I avoid the profanities, says like over my dead body, is that going to happen? Because Cochrane didn't want to report to Hobby. And she also talked to Arnold and said like, flying planes and like being a military pilot is so different from what the women in the Army Corps are doing, because like 95% of them were considered to be traditional for women, like communications, etc. And so she's like, I think that I don't think that this is a good idea otherwise. And so she is like, no, we're not doing that. And Arnold decides to go along with Cochrane's decision and is like, okay, we're not going to put the WASP with the Women's Army Corps, so they won't be on the same bill. And so there are some women who serve in the WASP who are going to talk about the fact that they blame Cochrane for that and are like, oh, well, if you'd have just, put us on the bill. But I always, like personally as a historian, feel like we have the benefit of hindsight of knowing how everything went down, and like who knows what would have happened, right? If the WASP, maybe that would have hurt the Women's Army Corps, and then they wouldn't have, like it's just too many factors. But yeah, they had a very contentious relationship because Cochrane very much loved her leadership role and did not want to report to anyone else. And in many instances, she would offend commanding officers on bases because she would go to General Arnold directly because they were friends and like she knew him personally. And they're like, you have to follow the chain of command. You literally cannot be doing this. And so that kind of tells you about her personality. Yes, in the front.
Much relationship post-World War II between the traditional women's service organizations and the WASP in terms of gaining the recognition. In the 30 years that elapsed between the end of the war and recognition, was there a fraternal bond, a bond between narrowing between traditional women's veterans groups and this group?
Yeah, that's a great question too. So thinking about the WASP, getting military status later in the 60s and 70s, the question is what interaction, if any, was there between other female veterans of World War II? Was there that sort of camaraderie, or did they support the WASP on that journey? So the answer is that there are some women who, because just like in every conflict or war, there are veterans groups that get together. So there are some women's veterans groups that support the WASP. The WASP are getting petitions to they're basically just getting signatures. So some of those women's groups will sign petitions for them or pass out information. The WASP get support from male pilots who also served in the Army Air Force actually as well. So there are going to be several key important World War II pilot veterans, for example, Barry Goldwater is going to support their military campaign because he was stationed with them at Newcastle Army Air Force Base in Delaware, for example. And so these male pilots are going to be yes, we were all doing the same thing, they should have military status, veteran status eventually. And then the other people that they get help from are the local chapters of the American Legion and the VFW. So the WASP basically would network with whomever they could. And so they would go to the VFW and American Legion in the areas in which they lived. The reason why I said local chapters is because the national level, the National American Legion and the National VFW, did not support the WASP in the 60s and 70s with their quest to get veteran status. And in fact, there's a lot of contentious discussion in Congress, but also from the VFW and American Legion, where they say things about the women pilots that are derogatory about women's service and try to imply in some of their statements that the veteran is someone who served in combat, which is very much not the case, even when you look at World War II. And so it's really interesting how they're trying to keep veteran status from the WASP. And in some cases, they say that it will forever denigrate the term veteran if we give it to the WASP and say these other very dramatic things before Congress. And so those national chapters are not supporting them, but all these local chapters I found were. So it's kind of interesting who supported them. The Air Force Association also supported them. Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah, so we have a couple. I just want to pass along some praise from the chat, including historian Carol Levin, who portrays a WASP, and Baumgartner Carl and Jerry Cobb. Thank you for the information. We have a question from user CR-C31in8. What was the age of the youngest woman pilot? Dr. Parry Myers said that the acceptance age for training was 18 and a half or older.
Yeah, so 18 and a half is the youngest. Sometimes I get the question and associated with this, so I'm going to just add on in case this is what you're also thinking about, is that there are a few WASP who are still alive. I don't have an exhaustive list, but Nell Stevenson Bright just turned 104 years old. And so for reference, there are still some of them out there, and at least Bright at the very least.
Well, I know Sarah's going to sign books. I'm sure she would be happy to answer other
Yeah.
questions. But otherwise, a little token of our
Thank you.
appreciation, and I think we all are a round of applause.